Chapter 5 Season 3 FNCS Grand Finals has just ended, and with that, 6 different duos have been crowned the champion in each region. But what exactly are some of the strategies these teams used in order to claim the active champions? Let's start with the region that had the most drama and the back-to-back champs, NA with Peterbot and Pollo. You all know by now this tournament was extremely close, with a bunch of teams having the potential to win and Clix being in first pretty much the entire time. But during day 2 he was griefed heavily, which potentially was the reason for him not winning. On top of that, you have a completely separate duo that pretty much every single pro player was convinced was cheating, yet the duo in question never got banned, so nobody knows for sure. With all that out of the way, let's talk about the winners, who many still think are cheating for some reason. Peterbot and Pollo have had one of the most impressive runs we've ever seen so far this chapter, with an impressive second place in Season 1, a historically dominant performance in Season 2, then winning again this season. This time they decided to claim another mythic POI, being Redline Rig. You all should already know what's up with this POI, having the shield medallion and arguably the most broken AR we've ever seen in this game, which in the hands of Peterbot just looks like straight up aimbot. They were already a favorite to win, but one day before Grand started, Epic Games announced that Slurp Cacti would no longer regenerate, which was most teams' strategy going into Grands. However, this helped them since they had the medallion, meaning they could still trade damage without a problem. Since they're also easily the best fighting duo in NA, they have no problem pushing teams around them to try to get kills or just get their surge up. Being comfortable making these plays also helps them a lot later on. Like most duos, one of them carries a crash pad and the other nitro for rotation. This goes for literally every single team I mentioned, by the way. Since, like I keep saying, they already have the medallion, they opt to both carry Fizz whenever possible, since this mixed with crash pads sends you so much further. And since they only need a little bit of extra shield, this just works perfectly. During the mid game, they also have no problem tanking a bunch of storm damage, because they know there's so many different movement items near them. Throughout the mid game, their aggression doesn't stop. Whenever they need a refresh or see an opportunity for a kill, they go for it. However, most of the time they don't need to, because they always play for the Rift Island, even if they don't get the loot from it. And there's multiple reasons for this. They can either go up and farm materials, put attachments on their guns, or obviously just use the launch pads to help them rotate to that next zone. Of course though, it's in the end game where the real magic happens. In an ideal game, they'll first use their crash pads to rotate the first moving zones. And during this time, they're always looking for any free kills or refreshes. Eventually, when they see an opportunity to take height, whether that's them being shambles or they're just not fully established, they full send for it. From here, Peterbot and Pollo are so good at applying pressure, even when they have barely any materials, they still easily keep it. Now, if they aren't able to get height, they have no problem just running through the mid ground, then towards the end, once they're out of materials, relying on their insane aim to keep pushing, and clearly it works out really well. It will be interesting to see if Peterbot can perform at LAN and finally put those cheating accusations to rest. But this next region already has a player who proved himself at LAN, and that's Brazil with King and Phaser. Still don't know why this region is called Brazil despite a lot of the players not even being from there, but I digress. Their drop is just to the west of Peterbot and Pollo's, claiming Brutal Beachhead, which has the Nitro Mythic. Since they are uncontested, they loot the POI as fast as possible. Then they try to be a bit more aggressive on duos around them in order to secure some damage, since there's some barrels and Slurp Cacti around them no other team gets. During the mid game, they like to use the Fizz Nitro Hoop trick in order to get as center map as possible and claim a spot to build a surge base. Being center earlier on means that they have more potential to get the next few zones, and for the most part can control how close other teams get to them. This is something to do whenever possible throughout those next few zones, prioritizing being more towards the center so they aren't on the congested side. Going into the end game, King and Phaser love going for height. Whether it's during the first moving zones or in the last one, whenever they have the materials and see an opportunity, they go for it. Now obviously this doesn't happen every single time. Since they are fantastic fighters and do a very good job at staying on top of each other, they are able to constantly look for refreshes, and if they are able to get enough mats to safely take and keep height, then they go for it. However, a lot of the times that perfect moment where refresh doesn't happen, so in that case, they're happy to just play mid and low ground. With that win, Phaser now has 2 FNCS titles to his name and King with 5. However, this next region has 2 first-time champs, and obviously, it's the best OCE. The winners are players you've probably never heard of, despite them being extremely consistent so far this year, previously placing 2nd and 3rd during the last 2 FNCSs, and that's Kazi and Aspect. Looking at their match history, they barely have any pop-off games, games, instead opting for consistency over anything else. And since it's OCE, of course some of their games were a bit interesting to say the least. For the most part, they were dropping at Redline Rig, however a couple of times they actually went to the split to the west instead because occasionally they were contested, in other games they were not. By the way, only around 10% of you guys watching are actually subscribed, so double check that you are. We're trying to hit 100k by the end of the year. Now I'm gonna be honest, there's not really much to talk about with this region. I say this because it doesn't seem like they really had that solid of a set game plan like these other teams I mentioned so far. Not to say they're bad by any means, but in other regions, some of the stuff they do just wouldn't fly. That being said, they are really good at fast decision making, but constantly being in those situations leads to more mistakes than not. They also are completely fine just playing mid or low ground throughout mid game, rarely ever looking up for height, besides one game which they won because they realized nobody was on it. I'm very curious to see how they perform at globals since OCE has a reputation of not doing so hot. Another region who also unfortunately hasn't had the best luck at LAN is Middle East. However, the champions this season can definitely change things, and that's CalGamer and 7man. This duo is the Peterbot and Pollo of Middle East, and so far they managed to win the first season, then come second in season 2, then obviously win this time around. Throughout this entire chapter, they've been dropping Pleasant Piazza. Because of this, no one dares to contest them, which also means they get this bunker completely for free whenever it spawns. Something very interesting I noted about their mid game was the fact that a lot of the times they actually are extremely split from each other in order to maximize Surge, which is something you rarely see players do. Since they have all this extra loot around them, they can be a bit more risky whenever going for damage. I was also very impressed with a lot of their rotations throughout the game. They for sure know how to get into really good positions on dead side, which you don't see too often in smaller regions. Going into the end game, this duo is really good at any layer they play. They do try and take height sometimes, but rarely fully commit to it. For example, in this clip, they chop out height, which makes you think they'll eventually go for it. However, they decide staying mid and low ground is less of a risk, so they opt for that instead. And like I mentioned, they're good at every layer, so whether it's low or mid ground, they almost always have a good game. A big factor of that is their insane ability to get refreshes. They always know when and where to look, so it's no surprise that this is one of the scariest teams to fight in the Middle East. I'm extremely excited to see how they will play next month at Globals, but they most likely will be conned, so that will definitely hinder their performance. Now speaking of being contested at LAN, the same will most likely go for our winners on Asia, who I'm going to be honest, I've never heard of, and that's Koyota and Mipali. Sorry, I definitely butchered that. Their drop is Sandy Steps, and if you have been following Clix and Vino this season, you'll know this drop is extremely good. Having launch pads, a mending machine, and of course that forecast tower. Being on top of this hill gives them a whole bunch of opportunities to get Surge early on, which means they can take more time to plan out good rotations for the first few zones. Getting into the end game, it honestly reminded me a lot of OCE. Throughout a few of their matches, it seems like a good chunk of the time they're just barely skimming by instead of being the duo in control. Saying that, there are definitely some games where they are the duo in control for a good period of time. They also seem to be extremely good at catching teams off guard, which a lot of the time results in some refreshes. Unfortunately, there wasn't too much to note from Asia, however our last region definitely does have some, and of course it's EU with Vico and Flixi. Now I keep comparing a lot of the teams to Peterbot and Pollo since they're both insanely good fraggers who came together to play, and well, Vico and Flixi are quite literally the exact same. All of our winners so far have been landing at POIs closer to the edge of the map, but Vico and Flixi are much closer to the center compared to the rest going Reckless Railways. Now looking at their match history, it's very interesting to say the least, with them only having 2 top 5s the entire time, and both of them were wins. I mentioned how they're the only center map team who won, and it's for a good reason. Surge is a lot harder to get because there's less duos rotating around, so they have to be much more aggressive. However, this clearly works well considering the caliber of these players. There's also a forecast tower near this drop, and since nobody wants to fight them, they easily claim it whenever it spawns. This is a really cool duo to look at because they aren't afraid to capitalize on situations they find themselves in. What I mainly mean by this is they don't necessarily follow a similar plan each game. Instead, they decide to adapt to what happens around them. This may sound like somewhat of a bad thing, however, it obviously works out for them, and it's really interesting just because I've never seen any other top pros do anything like it. Examples of this would be in one game where they get a kill and see the solo running really far into Storm, so they decide to chase after him. Most teams wouldn't go for this because they'd end up really deep in zone, and that's exactly what happened. However, they were able to use this to their advantage in order to go dead side without any problems. Another one would be the Rift Island spawning right on top of them. Typically they don't go for it, but since it's right there, they might as well, even though going up could be a bit risky. However, it's definitely worth it since it's such a good position. And I do want to mention with that storm tanking thing, they actually do it a good amount in their games. And when looking at their end games, it's kind of the same. They play every layer really well, but what stands out the most was the reason for them winning in the first place, and that's their fragging ability. Despite, like I mentioned earlier, only having 2 top 5s, they by far had the most eliminations out of anyone. This is due to them constantly being on each other and always being so aware it seems like every other second they're getting another refresh. So in short, they pretty much won because they are really good fighters. If you guys enjoyed this video or found it somewhat helpful, be sure to drop a like, subscribe, and check out one of these videos here. Have an amazing rest of your days. Peace out.